In his past life, the protagonist Ferda hated the red dragon Valdrova because he believed she had ruined his life. But when she discovered that the only way for him to achieve his dream was with her heart, she opened her own chest and handed it over willingly. The saddest part was that they both shared the same dream, to start a peaceful family. Ferda realized it too late, so he used his last wish to go back in time and save her. Now Ferda travels to Valdrova's castle and meets her powerful maid Ruby. She blocks him from seeing the Duchess because every man before him only sought her power. Even after she shows her dragon form and pins him down with terrifying pressure, Ferda doesn't back off. He insists he's not after wealth or power, but wants to become Valdrova's fiancée and stay by her side. Hearing his sincerity, Ruby delivers the message. For the first time in a long while, Valdrova smiles knowing someone wants her for who she is, not for the power she holds. It all starts when the protagonist's father arranges a marriage for him with Archduchess Valdrova. His father states firmly that he is completely sure the young man understands exactly what that decision means. For Ferda Rosnova, receiving news of that engagement with the Archduchess felt like living through a terrible nightmare. For the protagonist to react that way, the woman must have been extremely unattractive. For any noble, those words were the equivalent of receiving a final sentence, leaving only two options. He could refuse the marriage and be cast out, or accept the deal and end up completely destroyed. But deep down he just wanted to feel like part of that family and be accepted by them. The servants constantly mocked him for training without any talent, calling the young man sickly and pathetic. Absolutely no one took Ferda's side, but he endured all that scorn and silence. Even with everything against him, the young man kept going and tried his best every single day. He always looked at his father hoping to see some sign of pride or recognition. In the end, his greatest wish was simply to be acknowledged and valued by his own family, until one of his brothers showed up to mock him, asking if he had lost his mind by starting to train. Ferda ended up defeated and humiliated on the ground while they told him he never had the right to try to become a knight. To make matters worse, he was even called a filthy outcast. All he wanted was to be accepted by the family, but when he looked out the window he saw that reality was completely different. His father simply turned his back and walked away from the window, proving he didn't care at all. At that moment, Ferda understood that everyone there had turned their backs on him a long time ago. Back in the office, the young man gathered all his courage and informed his father that he had decided to leave the family for good. His father just looked at him with a completely cold expression, showing no reaction or the slightest bit of affection. The man accepted with total coldness, and soon after, Ferda ended up outside the mansion gates in the middle of the night. His father even warned him harshly that from that moment on he was no longer part of the Rosnova family. Ferda began to tremble with rage, remembering that his father knew perfectly well how hard he was trying. Consumed by an uncontrollable fury, his eyes gleamed with a terrifying thirst for revenge. He swore to himself that never, under any circumstances, would he forgive his father for what he had done. At that instant, a mysterious red magic circle appeared around him. Reacting to all those intense emotions, he promised to make his father regret rejecting him, awakening that very day as a mage. Ferda had just awakened his magical powers at barely 18 years old. However, the other apprentices mocked him while he lay on the ground, saying he was already too old to want to become a mage. They laughed while asking if he even had enough intelligence to understand magic. Since everyone used internal energy as a base, Ferda ignored the mockery and released an absurd amount of mana that left the boys completely terrified. A red circle appeared and he revealed that his mana was fueled solely by his hatred and his desire for revenge. With all that dark energy built up, the young man triggered a huge explosion right there. Ferda discovered that the more he hated someone, the stronger his magical power became. After reaching the sixth circle of magic thanks to his hatred, the only task left was to return to the Rosnova mansion. He used his new powers to make the servants who had humiliated him destroy each other without any mercy. After that, Ferda made his two older brothers deeply hate each other. He watched closely as they both fought until they were completely destroyed on the ground. Finally, he faced his own father, the man he hated most, who desperately begged him to end his suffering. Ferda told his father to watch closely the ruin of the proud Rosnova family that he himself had built. The man completely lost his mind witnessing that absolute nightmare right before his eyes. With that, absolutely everything related to the Rosnova family disappeared from the world. However, that completed revenge still didn't seem enough to calm his heart. Several influential and powerful people joined forces with their swords to try to stop him at any cost. They surrounded him and declared him the greatest public enemy of the entire continent, promising to bring him to justice. But he survived once more and reached the 8th circle of magic, the highest level a human being could achieve. Ferda became an archmage knowing that people still hated him and that one day they would come after him for revenge. For that reason, he needed to reach the 9th circle, the realm of a demigod, to obtain absolute power. Researching ancient books, he finally found the last ingredient needed to reach that level. Seeing the book's page, he wondered if that wasn't simply a cruel joke from fate itself. The last ingredient he so desperately needed was the heart of the red dragon, Archduchess Valdrova. The dragon spoke about how fate really enjoyed playing with people and being extremely ironic. He found it impossible to believe that the same person he was supposed to have married in the past was exactly the one now trying to take his life at this very moment. Ferda spat blood and clenched his teeth. He was visibly exhausted from the entire fight and filled with fury. The young man told the tyrant Valdrova to just accept her end and finish everything at once. The dragon replied that she knew many people called her a tyrant, but asked what the reason for all that hatred was. She explained that she had always lived isolated from everyone and never understood why humans hated her so much. Ferda confronted her with a look full of rage, asking if she really believed she had never done anything wrong. Then he shouted that her obsession with finding a husband was the reason he was cast out of his own family. The creature asked in confusion if all of that was really her fault, and he confirmed it with absolute certainty. The young man complained that a wild dragon's ambition to get a human partner ended up destroying his life. After listening to the whole explanation, the creature just said she finally understood what had happened. Hearing that calm response, Ferda began to suspect without understanding what had just happened, but he decided to ignore it because that pause gave him enough time to gather his mana. Then the dragon prepared to attack and launched one of her claws at the protagonist. Surprised, Ferda tried to defend himself using his magic barrier. A devastating blow hit him square on, and blood began to run down the protagonist's face, but to his surprise it was the dragon's blood as she started opening her own chest with her claws. Ferda was completely horrified and confused, not understanding why she was doing that to herself. Afterward, the creature asked if his magic really needed a dragon's heart to work. Desperate, he realized she wanted to tear open her own chest and shouted for her to stop immediately. Little by little, the dragon continued opening her chest. Ferda raced against time to stop her, because that heart was his only chance to evolve his magic. He cast a spell to try to stop her. The attack hit right in the center and the huge dragon began to stagger backward from the blow. Ferda screamed in desperation as he saw her claws still squeezing her chest area. When the dragon fell to the ground, the young man desperately wondered what had happened to the precious heart. He focused his gaze and noticed the reflection of an intense golden glow in his own eyes. To Ferda's relief, the precious dragon heart lay completely intact before him. The creature calmly told him to take the heart, leaving the young man totally confused by that action. He wondered why she would do something like that when she could have just tried to defeat him in battle. She revealed she did it solely because she understood that her own existence had brought suffering to his life. The poor dragoness really was pitiful. The dragon began to recall her entire lonely and painful past in the deepest darkness. Valdrova confessed that she had always hated herself and also the violent blood that ran through her veins. She deeply despised the uncontrollable urge to cause destruction for no reason. That monstrous, out-of-control version of herself was something she couldn't bear to face. In the past, whenever she took her human form, her presence caused fear and chaos wherever she went. She knew perfectly well that her mere existence was enough to fill everyone around her with terror. She regretted ever dreaming of happiness, knowing that that naive wish ended up making many people suffer. A sincere tear began to fall from the huge eye of the defeated dragon in the middle of the darkness. Since everyone had suffered because of her, she hoped he could find happiness through her sacrifice. With that, the gigantic creature finally disappeared and fell lifeless onto the dark ground. Ferda felt a strange pressure in his chest and wondered what kind of feeling that was. The young man grew quite annoyed realizing that such a longed-for victory was leaving such a bitter taste. He shouted in frustration that the dragon had tried to confuse his mind right up to her last breath. Ferda tried to focus on his true goal, remembering that the ninth circle was right in front of him. Then he raised the glowing dragon's heart to finally obtain absolute power. Ferda thought that if he could absorb all that power at once, he could finally surpass the limits of humanity and be reborn in that world as a powerful and feared demigod. A gigantic explosion of light and dust violently consumed the entire area. Suddenly, the landscape completely changed and he found himself floating naked inside an immense dark void. Ferda wondered what was happening, since he had absorbed the dragon's heart perfectly, but the young man's sensation was like sinking deeper and deeper into an infinite swamp. He began to wonder if that endless fall was just a side effect of the absorption. At that instant, an immense and uncontrollable wave of foreign feelings invaded his mind. A powerful bolt of magical lightning struck the young man's head directly in the middle of the darkness. With that, Ferda understood, completely surprised, that those memories and feelings actually belonged to Valdrova. He finally saw the truth and understood what that creature had felt all that time. There was an ancient and very deep despair that made his own seem insignificant, but also an enormous and quiet loneliness. Ferda understood that all the rage and hatred that had fueled his journey to take her life were painfully small, and he wondered through tears what he had really just done. The young man began to ask himself what he had truly wanted so badly. To become an archmage, to take revenge, or to turn into a demigod. At that moment he remembered when he was just a little child drawing alone at a table. He understood that the answer to that question had always been a resounding no. All he wanted was to draw his whole family together on a piece of paper and be accepted by them. His one true desire was always to have a simple family and live in peace. Remembering Valdrova's human form, he wondered with immense sadness if she shared that exact same simple dream that he had. The mage realized that his entire pursuit of power and revenge had absolutely no meaning. The dragoness had already disappeared by his own hands, making his greatest achievement feel completely hollow. Sincere tears full of regret began to fall down the young mage's face. Then he remembered that the only magic a ninth circle mage could cast was the wish spell. Even though he thought it was all useless, Ferda decided to cast the ultimate magic inside that bright circle. Suddenly, the young man heard a familiar voice calling his name and opened his eyes in surprise. Looking around, he realized he had returned to the luxurious office in his family's mansion. In front of him was his father, Irenbel Rosnova, scolding him for getting distracted while they were both talking. Ferda remembered that man had lost his mind before dying and began to suspect exactly what day it was. His father repeated the same words, saying that his arranged marriage with Archduchess Valdrova had already been decided. Then he added that he was completely sure the young man understood very well what that decision meant. His father began to warn him that if he decided to reject the engagement with the Archduchess, the Rosnova family would take action. Ferda stepped forward and realized, completely surprised, that he had actually managed to travel to the past. He interrupted the man decisively and stated with total firmness that he understood the entire situation perfectly. Ferda swore that this time he would not run away and officially announced that he accepted the engagement with Archduchess Valdrova. The second son of the family, Yukin Rosnova, was completely shocked to learn that his brother had accepted the engagement. Yukin asked the servant if he had heard correctly, because his brother was not the type of person who would willingly walk toward his own ruin. The butler explained that Ferda was about to leave, but that he had dismissed all the servants and locked himself in his own room. Yukin smiled maliciously and decided to go visit his younger brother to mock his desperate face. Meanwhile, inside his room, Ferda was calmly pacing back and forth. Suddenly, Yukin kicked the door open, shouting and angrily asking why he hadn't left yet. But when he looked inside the room, The older brother showed an expression of absolute surprise and amazement. He was stunned to see the younger one dressing calmly, since he was sure he would find him crying in fear. Ferda looked at him calmly and questioned his brother's lack of manners for entering without knocking. Noticing that Yukon was still surprised because he was dressing himself, Ferda explained that he had dismissed the servants to get used to not depending on anyone. Yukon suspected such a sudden change and asked if he really understood what the engagement meant. Ferda answered with absolute calm that he understood perfectly. Basically, it meant being cast out of the family. Yukon let out a nervous laugh and said he was actually going to destroy his own life, asking if he knew why it was always empty. With an extremely cold and determined expression, Ferda simply replied that he knew the whole story perfectly. In the past, Valdrova's first fiancé was the third prince of the empire. He was the perfect man thanks to his intelligence and beauty, and had even rejected the throne to accept that engagement. However, just one day after arriving at the territory to marry the dragoness, he appeared in a miserable state with his eyes completely motionless. He had been crushed brutally to the brink of death on the ground. He pointed at Ferda and asked if he really believed he would survive something that even the prince couldn't withstand. Then he shrugged and said he didn't plan to stop a fool who wanted to walk straight into the dragon's jaws, but his brother threatened him, warning that he shouldn't even think about escaping, because he himself would cut off Ferda's head before Valdrova could do it. Ferda looked at him with contempt and coldly replied that his older brother should learn to control his temper better. Then he threw it in his face that everyone already knew about the looks he gave his older brother's wife. The brother tried to lunge at him full of hatred, but Ferda mockingly warned him that he would have to hold back his urge to hit him. He smiled and commented that his face was too valuable at that moment to allow any blows, saying that the journey to the dragon's territory would be long. Ferda said goodbye calmly and walked toward the carriage. The old middle-aged butler began to sob uncontrollably into a handkerchief during the young man's departure. Through tears, the servant said it had been a true honor to serve the young master all those years. Ferda knew that was a lie, because if it had truly been an honor, he would never have poisoned his food. Then he remembered that during his childhood he thought he was naturally weak, not knowing that not even the servants were on his side. Just recalling that dark time, the young man felt deep disgust and a strong urge to strangle the butler. However, he simply placed a hand on the servant's shoulder and thanked him for all his work over so many years. He commented with irony that surely it hadn't been easy to put up with him for so long. Leaving the butler completely tense from that comment, Ferda asked him to take good care of his former family during his absence and finally climbed into the carriage to sit inside. He realized that his mind was at peace, perhaps because he had already taken revenge on everyone in another life. He leaned his head back and silently watched all the beautiful nature passing by outside the window. Ferda felt that all that uncontrollable fury and that insatiable thirst for revenge had disappeared from his chest forever. The young man reflected that the red magic based on hatred he used to wield acted almost like a drug. At first it was very exciting, but as his body developed resistance, that power slipped completely out of his control. When madness took over his body, everything around him seemed extremely exciting and euphoric. But now, Ferda knew perfectly well that he no longer wanted to live such a destructive and empty life as before. For him, experiencing that feeling of peace and tranquility after so long was proving quite pleasant. Suddenly, the journey came to an end and the coachman announced in a terrified voice that they had finally arrived. A wooden sign in the middle of the forest warned that the Archduchess's territory began there and that entry was strictly forbidden. The young man stepped down from the carriage and sat calmly on his travel trunk to wait. The coachman quickly drove off, shouting from a distance that he hoped the young master would stay safe. Ferda thought it was better not to be watched, though he calculated he would have to use simple fourth circle spells if any wild beast appeared. At that moment, the wind blew harder and swept up several leaves, immediately grabbing the young man's attention. Ferda directed his gaze toward the forest and made out the mysterious silhouette of a girl hidden among the plants. The young woman dressed in a maid uniform approached and formally introduced herself as Ruri, the faithful servant of Valdrova. Then she asked if he was the young Ferda Rosnova and the boy calmly confirmed his identity. Ruri made a gesture with her hand indicating that she would accompany him and guide him along the path to the castle. The inhabitants of the Archon Empire took pride in their supposed absolute power, ignoring the flaws of their own nation. At the eastern end of the continent lay the dangerous Demon Lands, a place full of monsters impossible to tame. However, it was the fearsome red dragon Valdrova who managed to stop the advance of those beasts and control the entire frontier. Ferda thought it was unfair that she had such a bad reputation, since she had built the only line of defense to protect that dangerous place. As several wolves surrounded them in the forest, he remembered that people constantly invented rumors saying she was building an army of beasts. However, all those lying cowards would never have the courage to say something like that in front of the huge dragon. Noticing the young man's concern about the monsters around them, Ruri turned and told him not to worry. She used a slight protection or healing magic and assured him the beasts would not attack them recklessly as long as he stayed by her side. He asked how long it would take to get there on foot, and she replied it would be 2 hours, which made him wonder how she had gotten there so fast. With complete naturalness, Ruri said that if she had traveled alone and decided to fly, the trip would only have taken 10 seconds. Ferda understood that, as he had suspected, she was no ordinary maid. Ruri was a powerful dragon descendant with innate physical strength and magic, hiding her horns and tail from humans. Knowing that, the young man firmly planted his wooden staff on the ground in a very determined way. He proposed they fly to the lair, but she replied by asking if she would have to carry him in her arms the whole way. The young man said he could handle the flight without any problem, but Ruri directly answered that she simply didn't want to carry him. The two ended up walking in complete silence along the path through the thick forest. He suggested resting a bit, but she told him to keep walking because her mistress was already waiting for his arrival. Ferda made a discouraged expression upon realizing he would have to endure the entire walk while exhausted. The young man thought to himself that the path to marriage really never was a simple task. After walking for a long time, the maid finally called out to the huge castle gate of the territory. She announced loudly to her mistress that her fiancé had just arrived. Ferda felt an absurd pressure coming from inside and was amazed by the dragon's immense presence. Ruby told him to wait there while she went inside to deliver the message, but the young man proposed speaking face to face. The maid looked at him furiously and asked if someone of his position really believed he had the right to see the Archduchess in person. Shortly after, she returned outside announcing that she would deliver the official message from Archduchess Valdrova. The maid congratulated the young man on behalf of her mistress for having come so far, even knowing how difficult the situation was. However, she immediately warned him that the Archduchess had no desire or interest whatsoever in carrying out a forced engagement. Hearing the order to leave, Ferda was surprised they were sending him back after the whole journey. He thought that if it had been in his past life, he would have accepted that offer and left at that very moment, but now he was a completely different person and being at that castle was a decision made solely by him. Ferda firmly declared that he had no intention of returning and that he truly wished to go through with the engagement. The young man asked if she wasn't going to deliver his response to her mistress, making the maid reluctantly agree. Shortly after, Ruri reappeared struggling to carry a huge heavy sack full of gold coins. She dropped it on the ground and explained that the Archduchess praised his courage and offered him all that wealth if he needed it. The maid added that the money was for him to leave that place and rebuild his life elsewhere. But Ferda looked at all that fortune and stated he had no interest whatsoever in power or wealth. The young man calmly extended his hand and began to reveal what his true desire was. He declared with determination that his only interest was to fulfill the engagement with Archduchess Valdrova. Hearing all that insistence from the young man, Ruri closed her eyes and let out a deep sigh of anger. Suddenly, overcome by a sudden rage, she clenched her fist tightly and threw a punch into the air. Then she pointed at Ferda with her finger and harshly demanded that he leave that place once and for all. Ferda commented that that answer was too brief to come from the Archduchess, and she confessed that those words were entirely her own. At that instant, horns appeared on her head and her nails grew into sharp claws as she launched a direct threat. Ruri unleashed her monstrous green magical aura, finally revealing her huge reptilian tail. The young man tried to shield himself from that terrible pressure, realizing it was the terrifying dragon fear. The force threw him to the ground and she began to scream that she knew perfectly well that mortals like him were nothing but garbage consumed by ambition. Lying on the ground, Ferda finally understood that it was precisely that arrogance that led the third prince to end up completely destroyed. Ruri confirmed it was true and explained that the prince only wanted to take advantage of the marriage to subdue and dominate the dragon. She complained that he was nothing but a shameless man who thought he could hide such obvious greed. The maid took a firm step forward and stated that the former fiancé had truly been an extremely arrogant man. Ruri pinned him to the ground by placing her claws on his chest, saying she saw no difference between them. Then she asked if he truly wanted to suffer the same tragic and painful destiny as the prince. However, even in such a dangerous situation, Ferda only gave her a small confident smile. Ruri was surprised when the young man began to make a sincere oath, assuring that there was no lie in his words. He guaranteed that no one had forced him to come there and that he wasn't seeking money or personal benefits either. He remembered that in his other life the dragoness had given her own heart to save a selfish man like him. Ferda promised that this time he would stand firmly by her side, declaring out loud that he had come to become her fiancé. He also said that since they were going to marry, she herself should speak directly with him instead of sending a maid. The maid's fist began to tremble with rage, considering the young man's boldness completely insolent. She lunged at him with her claws ready, shouting furiously for him to stop saying such nonsense. Suddenly, Ruri froze completely in midair right in front of Ferda. She withdrew the attack with her claws, reluctantly stepped back a few paces, and asked him to excuse her for a moment, receiving Ferda's calm approval. Inside the castle, the maid faithfully conveyed to her mistress the bold words spoken by the young man. Afterward, she made a respectful bow on the floor and concluded that that was exactly what he had declared. Ruri remained kneeling before the enormous silhouette of the dragon who held absolute power over all that territory. The Grand Duchess Valdrova, in her beautiful human form, asked in surprise if the young man had really said all that. Filled with curiosity about such boldness, the red-haired duchess confessed that she wished to discover what kind of person he really was. Ruri explained that he was incredibly weak and seemed about to faint from exhaustion just after walking to the castle. The maid commented with contempt that he was a very useless man and suggested kicking him out immediately, but received a stern look from her mistress. Ruri apologized awkwardly and confessed that actually the young man was quite handsome. However, the duchess replied that that hadn't been her question. After letting out a long resigned sigh, the maid admitted that the young man really didn't seem like an ordinary human. She explained seriously that as a dragon descendant, it was extremely easy for her to terrify any simple mortal. However, she reported that Ferda showed not the slightest sign of fear, even after she released her full terrifying aura. For that reason, she believed the young man would be perfectly capable of looking directly into the duchess's own eyes. Suddenly, Valdrova let out a soft and mysterious laugh that completely surprised the maid. The duchess commented with a satisfied smile that she liked that attitude very much. The young man was very happy to know that at last there existed a human being capable of holding her gaze directly. She was also glad to understand that they could finally talk and see each other face to face in a completely normal way. Ruri repeated those words with considerable surprise, finding it very strange that her mistress wished to act so normally. The duchess confirmed it affectionately while the maid simply accepted the orders in absolute silence. Ruri returned outside and informed Ferda that her mistress had decided to go through with the engagement. Then she told him she would guide him to the guest room where he would be staying. Entering the luxurious room, Ferda observed with surprise that the place was much cleaner and better maintained than he had imagined. He asked who was in charge of the cleaning and Ruri answered with pride that besides the dragon, she was the only person living in the entire castle. Then she stated harshly that she was her mistress's only maid, coldly calling the young man a mere guest. Ferda found it strange that she called him that, but she replied that since the marriage hadn't taken place yet, he was just a guest. The young man compared her to a very protective guard dog and decided to ask when the engagement ceremony would finally take place. Ruri explained that the event would be simple and low-key and would take place within a month at the dragon's own lair. Ferda listened carefully to all the servants' explanations and calmly accepted every detail of the event. The young man grew quite thoughtful as he reflected that he only had a month before the official wedding date. The maid stared at him with her arms crossed, maintaining a completely watchful and distrustful attitude toward him. She warned him that no one was going to give him anything for free and that deadline would serve to prove his true worth. Ruby pointed her finger and demanded that in 30 days he manage to earn a position worthy of being the partner of such a grand existence. The young man was surprised to hear that he would have to prove he possessed the necessary qualities to become her fiancée. Ferda made a resigned gesture and thought to himself that actually getting married was turning out to be a very complicated task. He asked if that demand was the Duchess's wish, but Ruri confessed it was a completely personal decision. She explained that her mistress was very naive and forgave everything, but that she wouldn't accept just anyone living inside that castle. Ruri demanded that, even with a weak body, Ferda had to prove through actions that he truly possessed great potential. She also warned him that if he failed that challenge, he would never be recognized as a worthy partner for the dragon. The young man closed his eyes and murmured thoughtfully at that enormous challenge imposed by the maid. Ferda directed his blue-eyed gaze forward and thought with satisfaction that his future wife had excellent allies by her side. He admired the maid's loyalty for always putting her mistress's safety first and for demanding the best from whoever would be her fiancé. But at the same time he wondered bitterly why those loyal allies hadn't been present during the final moments of his previous life. He accepted the challenge and asked ironically if he also needed to become emperor, but she replied that it was enough not to be someone despicable. Ferda found it amusing how simple that answer sounded, when in reality it meant proving a potential superior even to an emperor. With a slight confident smile on his face, the young man accepted all her conditions and stated that he had understood them perfectly. Ruri watched him quite annoyed, not understanding why that human remained so calm and relaxed in the face of such a dangerous situation. She asked him angrily if he thought dragons were easy to deal with or if he had some mental problem, but he calmly denied it. Ferda asked her not to worry and assured her that in just 1 month he would prove his true capability. Ruby continued watching him distrustfully, wondering where all that enormous confidence that human displayed came from. Night fell over the Grand Duchess's huge castle while the full moon shone in the dark sky. Ferda walked around his room thinking that he really needed to prove his potential, since at that moment he possessed no magical ability. He remembered that mages were very scarce and that he was the only one who had reached the 9th circle, so recovering all that power was possible if he could find that same sensation again. For a mage, the first circle was the most important step, since it defined the direction of all the mana circuits. The blue circle was created through calm and stable meditation, being the path chosen by the vast majority of mages. In contrast, the red circle was born from violent emotions and hatred, a dangerous path that almost drove him mad when he was an archmage in his past life. He knew that following the same path as before would make him much stronger in less time, but he seriously doubted that choice. This time, Ferda decided to take a different path to make sure he wouldn't lose himself again during his new life. A week passed inside the castle under a completely clear sky. Ferda sat on the floor of his room with his legs crossed to try to meditate. He concentrated deeply and began to form a small bluish magical energy between his hands. After letting out a tired sigh, he watched that energy disappear and realized he had failed again in his attempt. He reflected that creating a blue circle normally took about 3 years, but he had thought he could achieve it quickly thanks to the memories he retained after returning in time. Knowing that only 3 weeks remained, Ferda was interrupted by Ruby, who entered the room asking if he was really preparing himself. He replied that he was doing his best, but the maid looked at the food and muttered with annoyance that up to that point nothing had changed about him. Ferda kept eating calmly and said everything would work out if he kept trying, leaving the young woman silent and quite irritated. As he finished his meal, the young man admitted to himself that he had made no progress and needed to find a different method. Suddenly, a violent tremor shook the entire room, completely startling the young man. Ferda asked what that vibration was, and Ruri explained that her mistress was hunting monsters at that very moment. The young man found that hunt strange, but the maid explained that the Duchess was personally eliminating the creatures coming from the east. Hearing that, Ferda directed a thoughtful look toward the window and murmured Valdrova's name. Then he stood up decisively and informed the maid that he wished to witness that battle with his own eyes. Ruri firmly rejected the idea, making the young man ask why he couldn't go. She explained seriously that a common human's mind could never withstand contemplating a battle of that level. She even mocked him, saying it was better that he didn't watch if he didn't want to make a fool of himself before the engagement ceremony. The young man struck the table firmly and completely rejected the advice to stay on the sidelines. Ferda declared that witnessing that battle was the duty of whoever would be the Duchess's partner, insisting on seeing everything up close. And faced with such stubbornness, Ruri spread her dragon wings and flew off quickly through the sky while carrying the young man with her. Shortly after, both landed on a grass-covered meadow and the maid announced that they had finally arrived at the place. Ferda fell to his knees on the ground, feeling dizzy from the absurd speed of the trip, which almost felt like teleportation. With his stomach churning, he complained about the discomfort, but the maid told him to focus his attention on the real objective. Then she harshly ordered him to stand up and look forward once and for all. Both watched from the top of a cliff where a thick dark purple mist covered the entire region below. As he directed his gaze toward the abyss, Ferda's eyes opened wide and he was totally stunned by what he saw. He wondered if that dark valley full of giant monsters was exactly the place where Valdrova was fighting. In the middle of the darkness, the monstrous creatures collided violently in a deafening battle. Suddenly, the huge red dragon appeared flying in the center of a gigantic explosion of flames. Two enormous serpents tried to lunge at the dragon while roaring terrifyingly on the battlefield, but the dragon's powerful claws pierced the skin of one of the creatures without the slightest difficulty. Then the dragon bit down hard on the monster's neck while intense flames began to glow inside its mouth. The burning energy quickly gathered in the dragon's throat, lighting up the entire area. Then it released a devastating breath of fire that reduced everything in its path to ashes. The enormous wave of heat and strong wind reached the top of the cliff, but Ruri remained completely steady and calm in the face of the impact coming from below. The dragon let out an extremely deafening and intimidating roar. The sonic impact of that roar spread throughout the valley like an overwhelming shockwave. Feeling the crushing pressure of that creature, Ferda began to sweat cold and tremble with fear at such power. Then he fell to his knees on the ground, completely stunned upon realizing the absurd strength possessed by who would be his future wife. The terrifying aura of the dragon's roar deeply affected the mind of any human who heard it up close. Trembling and with a hand on his chest, Ferda tried to catch his breath while Ruri asked him if he had finally understood the situation. Ruri coldly stated how ridiculous it was for a mere human to dare to join with a being as powerful as a dragon. She pointed at the enormous dragon and said that was the true form of who would be Ferda's future partner. The maid mockingly repeated how absurd it was for a simple human to want to form a bond with such a powerful dragon. She insisted that that immense destructive creature was exactly the partner he had chosen to have by his side. Ruri noticed the young man's hand resting on the ground and realized he was trembling intensely under all that pressure. She thought to herself that he was reacting exactly as she had expected, confirming why she had warned him before. The young woman explained that in a red dragon's blood dwelled what humans called a fierce nature. It was an unstoppable existence, incapable of living without destroying everything in its path and filled with an extremely violent instinct. Ruri said that fury was innate and asked if he now understood the daily danger of becoming a dragon's partner. The maid reflected that humans and dragons would never be equal and that her mistress would eventually realize that that engagement was nothing but a useless dream. However, Ferda lifted his head with a smile on his face and murmured that all of that was truly magnificent, leaving the maid completely surprised. Ruri was astonished to realize that instead of feeling fear, the young man observed the dragon with completely sincere admiration and fascination. She took a few steps back quite frightened, wondering if that human was actually a completely insane person. Night returned to the silent castle while the moon shone peacefully in the star-filled sky. Lying on his bed, Ferda reflected that although he had mentally prepared himself to withstand that pressure, The impact had been enormous. He felt that his entire body was completely exhausted after suffering directly from the effects of fear and the dragon's roar. He remembered that the maid had carried him back and that she also seemed quite tired from the fast trip. He thought it was a real miracle that his mind had come out intact from that experience and understood that he had to concentrate so as not to waste the whole day without making progress. The young man began to wonder why he had decided to go observe that dangerous battle in the first place, remembering in detail all the impressive scenes he had witnessed in the valley that day. Suddenly, Ferda had a sudden inspiration and opened his eyes with a huge revelation. Although that scene had been terrifying, he understood that deep down he wished to keep observing his future wife up close. He reflected that she hid her true form in the eastern frontier while crushing and tearing apart terrible monsters. He understood that she did all of that solely to protect with all her strength what she loved most in the world. For Ferda, that determination represented the path of a noble knight who had voluntarily chosen a life full of suffering. He opened his arms, felt a gentle breeze, and thought about how truly admirable her attitude was. The young man smiled slightly and reflected on the enormous meaning of someone so extraordinary having agreed to stay by his side. At that moment, an intense red energy began to concentrate in his hands, making him realize with surprise that it was the red circle. Desperate, he tried to contain that energy because he knew he couldn't repeat the same mistakes from the past and needed to reject that power. However, looking more closely at the flow of that red mana, he grew intrigued by what he saw inside it. The image of the imposing warrior in red armor returned with full force to his thoughts. Ferda felt his heart beat strongly as he concentrated his entire mind on the imposing image of Valdrova. He realized that the more he remembered that battle, the clearer his magical circuits became, accompanied by a feeling that was neither hatred nor revenge. Sitting in meditation in front of that energy, he tried to discover what that mysterious emotion was before it disappeared completely. The young man focused all his attention on that feeling and began to compress and rapidly spin the magical energy between his hands. He maintained absolute concentration while the red mana shone intensely and took shape around his body. Ferda gathered all his willpower with the goal of creating a single powerful magic circle. He finally managed to form it successfully and smiled upon realizing that this time that energy was completely different from before. With a firm look, the young man promised himself that the same mistakes from the past would never repeat themselves in this new life. The next day, Rory entered the room and was completely surprised as she asked if he had really managed to activate his magical circuits in a single night. Ferda praised her observation skills while the servant insisted on knowing how he had achieved a feat that was normally impossible. He replied proudly that he had done it because he was not an ordinary person and asked her what she thought of his rapid progress. Ruby reluctantly admitted that he had met the requirements, but the young man acknowledged that he still had a long way to go. He put away his napkin while maintaining a very serious and focused expression regarding the next steps he needed to take. Ferda asked if there was any nearby place where he could train, and the scene shifted to a field with several practice targets. One of the straw dummies was quickly placed in the middle of the sandy terrain. Ruby appeared holding a broom and announced with pride that she had prepared the entire training area exactly as he had requested. Impressed, Ferda clapped and praised the maid's efficiency for having organized everything by herself in just half a day's work. She found it strange that he had asked for simple training targets instead of expensive items. Then the young man explained that he needed to train precise control of his mana. The young woman seemed confused and commented that for dragons that concern about controlling energy was as simple as practicing breathing. Ferda joked that other humans would consider that savage, but Rory proudly reminded him that she too was a dragon descendant. Ferda remained watching her in silence for a few moments, maintaining a calm and thoughtful expression after hearing her response. He thought that those born with natural power would never understand the effort humans made, but he still invited the maid to observe his simple control training. He knew that the basis of mana control was stability, which normally corresponded to the classic path of the blue circle. However, the circle he had decided to awaken this time was a red circle, which completely changed the rules. He needed to stir his emotions and at the same time keep them under control, because overcoming that contradiction was what would finally unleash his true power. In the past, it took him a full year to extract mana from that current of hatred and another year to condense it into a sphere. All that painful effort from his previous life had been necessary to successfully create his mana projectile again. However, thanks to all the accumulated experience, now he only needed 2 minutes to form exactly the same sphere. Ruri watched everything completely surprised and wondered how he had managed to perfectly control his mana and create a stable sphere on his first attempt. Ignoring her astonishment, Ferda easily manifested 3 other red spheres of energy floating around his hand. Then he pointed firmly at the targets and simply gave the order to fire the magical spheres. The projectiles shot out at high speed, tearing through the air and leaving behind a bright trail of destructive energy. With a strong explosion, the mana impact hit exactly the center of the target and destroyed it completely before the surprised maid's eyes. Satisfied, the young man looked at his own hands and commented with a slight smile that after all he hadn't lost his talent for magic. Ruri remained watching him in complete silence, analyzing with enormous seriousness the impeccable display of power she had just witnessed. Later, Ruri met with Valdrova inside a cave and finished her report on Ferda's early awakening as a mage. The Grand Duchess admitted she didn't really know how impressive that was and asked how the young man's performance had actually been during the maid's evaluation. Ruri replied that it had been perfect and that he had made no mistakes, which made her consider him a dangerous person, thus awakening her mistress's curiosity. She explained that it was impossible for a human to be so perfect without hiding some secret. She also commented that perhaps he was simply a very strange man who liked to suffer. Valdrova found it amusing how Ruri acknowledged a human's abilities so much, and the maid reluctantly admitted that he was truly surprising. The Duchess told her not to worry and said she would try to trust the sincere intentions the young man had shown toward her. Ruri watched her with concern, bitterly remembering how humans had deeply hurt her beloved mistress in the past. Then she swore to protect the Duchess's heart from new disappointments and wished to discover what the fiancé's true intentions were. After thinking of an idea, the maid proposed taking the opportunity to entrust Ferda with an important task. The Duchess smiled with curiosity at the proposal and asked exactly what mission she had in mind. Sometime later, Ferda appeared impeccably dressed in elegant red noble clothing while his arrival was formally announced. In the great meeting hall, the nobles of the territory gathered, surprised by the Grand Duchess's sudden summons. Some lords complained about that meeting due to the constant danger of monsters, but soon began commenting on the imminent arrival of her new fiancé. One of them was surprised to learn that someone had actually accepted that absurd proposal and asked who that fool could be. The nobles began to whisper cruel rumors saying he was just a weak young man who didn't even know how to use a sword despite belonging to a noble family. Seated at the head of the table, an elderly leader mocked the whole situation, stating that the young man wouldn't last long and that there was no reason to worry. The influential Count Oliveira assured that the fiancé would surely end up destroyed by the Duchess herself. At that very moment, the huge doors swung wide open with the official announcement of the fiancé's arrival. Maintaining an extremely elegant posture and a calm gaze, Ferda entered the hall, closely followed by the maid Ruri. Before that happened, the young man was quietly reading in the library and asked if it was really necessary to meet with the feudal lords. Ruri explained that it was essential and asked if he knew the reason why his mistress held the imposing title of Grand Duchess. He remembered that it had been Valdrova herself who in the past had personally eliminated the terrible black dragon Gadwin. Thanks to that great feat she obtained those lands. However, since she now devoted all her time to hunting monsters, her fiancé had to govern the region in her place. In short, the Duchess handled the external threats, while he had to manage all the internal affairs of the territory. Farah understood that she was testing his leadership ability and accepted the challenge of presenting himself before all the lords. Back at the meeting, the young man formally introduced himself as the future partner of the Grand Duchess and took the floor before the council. Without showing the slightest doubt, he coldly observed everyone and directly asked how they wished to be treated by him. That question took the lords by surprise, who understood from the first moment that the young man would not be an easy target to control. The old count smiled slightly and responded diplomatically that all those present were lords who faithfully served under the Duchess's protection. He stated that it was fair to show respect to his mistress's future fiancée, but made it clear that there were certain conditions that had to be discussed. The old man asserted his authority in front of everyone, reminding them that they had already sworn loyalty to the empire long before the young man was born. Then he suggested with irony that it was the fiancée who should show proper courtesy and respect toward all their long experience. Ferda listened calmly and then firmly asked if that was his final answer on how they wanted to be treated. He raised his cold and severe gaze, demanding that they simply answer his question directly. Pressured by the young man's presence, the old count swallowed, and full of nerves he ended up accepting that the fiancée had the right to speak to them with authority. Ferda continued saying that even after the marriage nothing would change directly, since the governance of each territory would remain in the hands of their respective lords. One of the nobles stood up, struck the table hard, and shouted full of rage, asking if the young man was implying that they robbed and exploited their own people. With total irony, Ferda raised a hand and apologized very sarcastically, saying it had only been a small slip of the tongue. The noble, completely irritated, responded mockingly and stated that he now perfectly understood the reason why the young man had been cast out by his own family. He pointed his finger at him and declared that he was nothing but a failed first circle mage. Then he demanded respect, reminding him that he was a far superior fourth circle mage. Ferda merely murmured calmly that a fourth circle mage was quite acceptable, showing no concern whatsoever for that threat. The opponent completely lost his patience and, clenching his teeth, asked what the young man had just said. He began to shout that fourth circle mages were treated as true authorities and that his position was defined solely by his enormous magical ability. Furious at being belittled by someone from the first circle, he began to gather all his magical energy with the intention of teaching him some respect. Faced with the start of the aggression, Ferda raised a hand with total calm and commented that he had an interesting proposal for his rival. He suggested that to verify the abilities of a mere first circle mage, they settle the matter with a duel right there. The scene shifted to a combat arena where the nobles commented that the outcome of a fight between a first circle mage and a fourth circle mage was more than obvious. In silence, Ruri just watched the whole situation, while other nobles wondered if Teselos would show any compassion toward young Ferda during the fight. The wind blew over the enormous stone arena as both rivals took their positions in front of all the spectators. With his hands in his pockets and a completely relaxed posture, Ferda directly asked what spell his rival planned to use. Teselos felt offended by that question and complained angrily that it was extremely discourteous to demand that information before the fight. He smiled with contempt and mocked, saying the young man must be dying of fear, offering him the chance to withdraw right then. Then, Teselos proudly announced that he would use the powerful fourth circle magic called Magical Explosion to finish him off. The spectators were surprised to hear the name of that devastating technique and began to murmur with concern, wondering if the young man would even manage to survive. Ferda remained completely calm and replied that he would also reveal his technique, coldly warning that the only spell he knew how to use was the mana shot. The opponent burst out laughing upon hearing that he would only use a simple mana shot, but the young man responded with absolute confidence that he had no intention of losing. He made a small gesture with his fingers and calmly commented that despite everything he possessed a huge amount of knowledge. Furious at so much arrogance coming from a simple human, Teselos shouted and began to concentrate all his destructive magical power. At that instant, a huge shining transmutation magic circle appeared beneath his feet, ready to unleash his deadly attack. Ferda noticed that his rival was unsteadily altering his emotions to increase his power. Recognizing him as another red circle user, he wasted no time. His 3 red projectiles shot out at high speed, crossing the entire distance of the arena. Teselos opened his eyes wide, filled with surprise and fear upon noticing the absurd speed with which those attacks were heading toward him. While controlling the energy with extreme precision, Ferda coldly warned that this confrontation was already completely decided. The beams of red light hit exactly in the center and pierced through his rival's defensive spell with impeccable precision. Teselos fell into despair upon seeing his powerful magic destroyed before he could finish casting it. Suddenly he realized that the young man's attacks had never been intended to hit his body directly. He was completely surprised to realize that Ferda had aimed specifically at the weak points of his transmutation circle to break it entirely. The shockwave from the magical rupture threw him backward. He couldn't believe that such a feat had been performed by a first circle mage. Filled with panic, he acknowledged that destroying an active magic circle was an absurdly high-level technique that even he couldn't execute. The man fell, bracing one hand on the stone floor of the arena that trembled while he was covered in the remnants of his destroyed mana. He ended up kneeling, completely exhausted and trembling, with no strength to continue the fight. After his magic flow was interrupted, he began to sweat cold and breathe with enormous difficulty. Teselos murmured in disbelief that he had just lost the fight. Ferda walked slowly toward the defeated rival and with total calm asked if he finally admitted his defeat. The man lifted his gaze with tear-filled eyes and stammered, unable to find words in the face of such humiliation. Instead of hurling insults, he confessed sincerely that deep down what he had most desired in his entire life was to become a stronger warrior. He lowered his head until it touched the ground and officially acknowledged his total defeat, assuring that he would do anything to obtain true power. The nobles began to murmur, completely surprised by the defeat of a fourth circle mage. But Ruri threatened to tear out the eyes of anyone who doubted Ferda's clean victory. Teselos shook the young man's hand with enormous respect, praising his mastery of magic and celebrating that the Eastern military force was in such good hands. The man smiled happily upon feeling that someone so strong recognized his worth and commented that having been expelled from the capital ended up being a great blessing. Ferda found the mention of the capital strange and asked his name, discovering that the mage was called Teselos Walter. Hearing that name, the young archmage felt a strong memory cross his mind and murmured thoughtfully that he finally remembered who that man was. With an intense look, Ferda surprised Teselos by revealing that in his other life he had been his great benefactor. The man was completely confused by that revelation, but was interrupted when the young man gently placed the tip of his finger on the center of his forehead. With a serious and focused expression, Ferda pointed with his finger again and whispered the command to fire his mana shot spell. Teselos took the point-blank impact and was violently thrown backward by the enormous power of Ferda's attack. The nobles watching the duel stood frozen with their mouths open at the shocking scene. Teselos fell lifeless and covered in blood on the arena floor, while the young man observed him from above with absolute coldness. Ferda thought he couldn't leave him alive, because in the future that man would end up causing great sorrow to his future wife. Under the absolute silence of the arena, he began to walk away from the defeated lord's body without showing the slightest remorse. At that moment, all the nobles present could only think of Ferda's name with absolute fear. The feudal lords began to tremble and whisper among themselves, terrified to realize that the young man had just taken a noble's life. They commented completely surprised that the duel was already over and that the young man had committed a cowardly act before they could intervene. However, none of those frightened nobles had the courage needed to step forward and confront him. The young man looked at the terrified crowd and ironically asked why everyone was so tense and motionless. Ferda stated that that man deserved that fate and that leaving him alive would only bring suffering to the Duchess, leaving the old count completely stunned. The count asked how he could claim something like that if it was the first time he had met Teselos and the other lords. With a mysterious smile, the young man calmly replied that his future wife wholeheartedly wished for humans to live happily. He explained that although she was a dragon, she fought to protect humanity and that Teselos's actions went against that will. The young man added that that would happen in the very distant future and for that reason he couldn't prove it at that moment, leaving all the nobles completely confused. They thought he was completely insane for killing someone because of a crime that hadn't even happened yet. But Ferda warned them that the rest's opinion didn't matter to him at all. Later, the royal carriage sped along the dirt road under an orange sky. Inside the vehicle, the young man curled his body and held his head in strong pain, letting out a groan of pure suffering. He complained that everything was spinning and that at that moment he felt extremely unwell. Ferda reflected that he had completely exhausted his mana after performing that precise mana shot against his rival. To make things worse, he was also suffering from severe nausea caused by the carriage's movement. While deeply missing the magical vehicles of the future, Ruri commented sarcastically with a bright gleam in her eyes that it had been a great idea to eliminate the Duchess's most loyal lord at his first meeting. The young man asked if she was talking about Teselos, and the maid confirmed that even though it didn't seem that way, he was truly very loyal to her mistress. Ferda grew a bit worried hearing that and decided to ask if that lord was truly a fair and honest man. Ruri explained that he was half honest and half corrupt, which was already the best you could find in that place, because the other nobles were a complete disaster. Still, the young man assured that the engagement would proceed normally, since the reason for eliminating Teselos was completely justified. He leaned back on the seat thoughtfully and closed his eyes to organize all his memories related to that noble's past. Looking at the sack where the defeated lord's head was stored, Farah tried to recover every detail from his memory. He remembered that precisely at that moment Teselos must have been committing a very serious crime within his lands. Upon arriving at the deceased noble's castle, the head butler made a respectful bow to welcome the Duchess's envoys. The butler informed them that his lord was not there, but Ferda responded with complete naturalness that the noble was actually already dead. Without wasting time, Ruri threw the heavy sack directly into the bewildered butler's arms and told him to hold it for the moment. Then she calmly ordered him to hang the sack's contents in a very visible place above the lord's castle gate. The butler opened the sack and fell into a state of absolute panic upon recognizing with horror that the head inside belonged to his deceased master. Ignoring the servant's desperation, Ferda and Ruri entered Teselos's luxurious room to look for secret evidence. Ruby warned him that they needed to find evidence of corruption, but Ferda reminded her that she herself had helped him by collecting the head from the corpse. She threatened to return the head and cancel the engagement, but the young man replied that he had just found a secret passageway under the bed. He began to run his hands over the wooden floor while searching for some hidden mechanism that could open the secret entrance. Seeing that the young man was taking too long, Ruri approached with authority and ordered him to move aside immediately. She planted herself firmly, concentrated all her enormous physical strength into her closed fist, and threw a powerful punch. With that overwhelming force, she completely destroyed the wooden floor, opening a huge hole. Ruri dusted off her hands and calmly commented that the passageway was now open and ready to enter. The two began to slowly descend a dark and cold stone staircase that led directly to the basement. Ferda and Ruby covered their noses, horrified by the unbearable stench of blood and decay that filled the entire underground place. There they found a secret laboratory full of surgical instruments and mutilated corpses of humans and monsters mixed together. That was Teselos's experimentation lab, a necromancer follower of the Demon King who used forbidden dark magic. Ferda watched in horror as a soldier from the territory lay chained up and realized that the noble was cooking monster organs into human bodies. Ruri felt enormous rage upon realizing that that psychopath had practically been begging to be eliminated. She angrily stated that humans were not trustworthy, though she admitted that that betrayal completely justified the noble's execution. However, she looked at Ferda with suspicion and asked how he knew about the existence of such a secret place. Without answering, the young man fixed his bright blue eyes on some documents and whispered with satisfaction that he had finally found what he was looking for. The document revealed the secret and nameless masterpiece of Teselos, the method for cultivating infinite mana. In the notes, Teselos explained that monsters produced mana constantly and infinitely within their bodies. However, that energy was impure and dark, so it normally couldn't be used for anything useful. But if they could artificially reproduce that biological ability to generate continuous mana, it would be possible to obtain pure mana infinitely, completely surpassing all the limits imposed by the magic circles. In those notes, Teselos laughed evilly as he planned to use an army of undead to destroy the nobles who had exiled him to the dragon's lands. The necromancer celebrated that he would soon become an archmage while young Ferda from the past life confronted him in silence. At that time, Ferda had also thought of using that valuable technique to fulfill his own revenge. In the end, the secret technique for cultivating mana fell back into his hands in this new life. Just as had happened before, he knew that studying that method would allow him to reach the 8th circle much faster, but he remained thoughtful and hesitated before making a decision. Ruri commented that he was as ambitious as any other human and said that no one would find out anything if he decided to keep those documents. With irony, she congratulated the young man for finding such a valuable opportunity to obtain the power that humans so desperately desired. But to the maid's surprise, Ferda handed her the manuscript and firmly rejected the idea of keeping it. The young man placed the documents in Ruby's hands and coldly ordered her to destroy absolutely everything inside the laboratory. She was completely surprised and asked if he was serious, unable to understand how a mage could reject such valuable knowledge. Ferda admitted that research could completely change the world of magic, but asked what all of that would really accomplish. In the end, he preferred to destroy that technique from its origin rather than let himself be seduced by power and end up causing sorrow to the Grand Duchess in the future. He looked directly into Ruri's eyes and firmly told her to burn all those forbidden documents. She remained watching him in silence for a few seconds and responded decisively that fulfilling that request would not be difficult for her at all. Immediately, intense blue flames began to rise from her hand and consumed the forbidden documents in an instant. The dragon's blue fire spread forcefully throughout the place, reducing every investigation and every mutilated body to ashes. Ferda knew that magic carried the essence of whoever used it and that Tezelos's mana had been completely corrupted by the twisted hatred he had accumulated in the past. Tezelos carried an enormous inferiority complex and a hatred as great as the one Ferda himself had carried within for years. If he inherited that dark magic, he would end up consumed once again by uncontrollable feelings, so he had to abandon it forever. He bitterly remembered his old self, who could only keep living by forcing himself to feel hatred at all times. Now, with a much calmer and relieved expression, he watched the ashes fly through the air and commented that everything was burning very well. Ruby stared at him, thinking he was an unpredictable psychopath and completely strange, though little by little she began to change her rigid opinion of him. Finally she sighed and commented that it was better to leave that damp, dark basement as soon as possible to return to the castle. The maid warned that it would be disrespectful to arrive smelling like blood before the great engagement ceremony with her mistress, leaving the young man quite excited. Finally, the day of the engagement ceremony arrived and everyone gathered at Archduchess Valdrova's castle. While the preparations continued, Ruri looked at Ferda and asked if he had finished writing the vows for the ceremony. Holding the papers in his hands, Ferda answered confidently that of course they were already ready. Holding a ceremony with vows personally written by each one was very romantic on the Archduchess's part. However, Ruri, with a disappointed expression, commented that was only a polite way of saying it and that it was absurd to hold an engagement ceremony in a place worse than a stable. Hearing those words, Ferda just watched her in silence. Deep down he thought she seemed worried. Although she wasn't especially excited about the engagement, she still wished for Valdrova's happiness. He found it a bit sad to see her struggling with such contradictory feelings. Noticing that he was staring at her, Ruby frowned and asked what that expression meant. She also warned him not to wrinkle the formal clothes she had ironed with so much effort. Ferda simply sighed to himself and thought it was fine if she vented her frustration on him. After a brief moment of silence, another thought crossed his mind. He remembered that everything had been quiet since the last meeting and began to wonder what the current situation of the Archduchess's territory was. Starting with the feudal lords, none seemed capable of properly managing the first line of defense. As soon as he expressed his concern, Ruri nodded without hesitation and confirmed that his judgment was correct. She explained that at first everything worked when the lords had autonomy. However, since no one oversaw their actions, they ended up obsessed with filling their own pockets. Moreover, they silenced any citizen complaints using military force. If things continued like that, a massive rebellion could break out at any moment. Hearing that, Ferda commented that the situation was very serious and asked if it wouldn't be enough for the Archduchess to intervene personally. He thought that with just one order from her, all those nobles would end up crawling on the ground begging for forgiveness. Ruri looked at him calmly before answering that he would soon understand why her mistress refused to intervene. Without saying anything more, she walked to the last door and stopped in front of it. Then she turned to Ferda and politely asked him to take a seat and wait. Afterward, she announced that the engagement ceremony was about to begin. As soon as Ferda sat down, an unimaginably powerful pressure fell upon him. Just the air escaping from under the door was so heavy it seemed to crush his entire body. Looking toward the door, he managed to see the enormous silhouette of Archduchess Valdroba's dragon body hidden behind it. Overwhelmed by that terrifying presence, he couldn't help but wonder if someone like him was truly worthy of presenting himself before Valdrova. Ruri stood nearby holding a ceremonial cup between her hands and began the ancient ritual. She declared that on that day mortality and immortality would become one, joined by a golden thread that neither the authority of the heavens nor the passage of time could break. She added that the mortal would unite by leaving behind the unknown and purifying his fear. As soon as the cup was presented, Ferda accepted it without hesitation and drank it in one go. The instant the liquid entered his body, he understood that this was no ordinary drink. The overwhelming aura radiating from the dragon began to slowly diminish, allowing him to breathe again. Continuing with the ceremony, Ruri declared that the immortal would also unite by leaving behind the emptiness of an eternal existence. Then she prepared another ceremonial cup and brought it toward the door. From inside, Valdrova slowly extended one of her enormous claws to receive it. However, due to the gigantic size of her dragon body, she couldn't hold the cup properly and it slipped from her claws until it shattered against the floor. Seeing the drink spilled on the ground, Ruri let out a small sigh and calmly said they would have to start all over from the beginning. Sometime later, the ceremony kept repeating itself. Once again, Ruri took her place and began reciting the same ancient words about how the mortal must unite by leaving behind the unknown. Meanwhile, Ferda silently drank another ceremonial cup. By that point, he couldn't help but complain to himself. He thought he had lost count of how many times he had to drink. It was the first time he had tasted alcohol in this life and he had already drunk too much. He felt that if he kept going like that, he would end up in serious trouble. The engagement ceremony had already started over so many times that Ferda had stopped counting. Every time they reached the same moment, Archduchess Valdrova extended a claw from behind the door to receive the engagement cup, but due to the enormous size of her dragon body, she would fail to hold it properly again. Just like in all previous attempts, the cup would slip from her claws and shatter against the floor, forcing the entire ceremony to restart once more. However, this time Ruri finally reached her limit. Her calm expression disappeared completely and was replaced by deep frustration. She turned toward the room behind the door and apologized before entering. The instant she crossed the door, she could no longer contain herself and began to shout with all her strength. She complained that her mistress had been the one who insisted on marrying a mortal from the very beginning. She recalled everything she had endured as a faithful servant and criticized that she remained hidden while her fiancé waited just on the other side of the door. She also asked what kind of image that gave in front of her future husband. Finally, she demanded that she come out proudly to receive her fiancé and threatened her, saying that if she spilled the engagement wine one more time, she would not forgive her. Since Ferda had remained outside the room the entire time, he clearly heard every single word of Ruri's loud scolding. The screams coming from inside left him completely frozen in shock. A few moments later, Ruri came back out with total calm, as if nothing had happened, and asked if he had heard everything that happened. Still trying to recover from the impact, Ferda said yes and commented that that roar had been on the same level as a dragon's breath. Ruri made a small gesture with her head and explained that that had been necessary for the ceremony to proceed normally, since her mistress was afraid of humans. Ferda looked at her in disbelief upon hearing that and asked in surprise if she was really afraid of people. Ruri continued explaining that Lady Valdrova avoided interacting with humans and for that reason never left her lair, except when she went out to hunt monsters. Hearing that, Ferda was completely stunned. In his mind, he thought that the great Valdrova had a weakness like that. Then he wondered how they could continue the engagement ceremony. Before anyone could say another word, a huge hand slowly appeared on the other side of the door. The heavy door began to open little by little, and for the first time Archduchess Valdrova came out in her humanoid form wearing beautiful armor. Although she had finally come out, she remained strangely silent before taking a seat. The instant Ferda saw her, he was speechless as he observed the dragoness before him. He thought that if she were in her true form, her size would be incredibly enormous. He had always heard that a dragon's transformation was of impressive beauty, but that appearance seemed more fitting for someone marching directly onto a battlefield. When everyone settled back down, Ruri continued the ceremony with total calm, as if nothing had happened. She declared that they would resume the engagement ceremony. She recited that the mortal would unite by leaving behind the unknown and purifying his fear. Then she added that the immortal would also unite by leaving behind the emptiness of an eternal existence. Upon finishing the ancient ritual, she carefully poured the ceremonial wine into the cups placed in front of Ferda and Archduchess Valdrova. This time, when it came time to drink, Valdrova slowly moved part of the armor covering her face to take a sip. The instant Ferda caught a glimpse of her appearance beneath that armor, he became completely motionless. His mind went blank and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He even thought that perhaps he had drunk too much ceremonial wine. He even felt that the deepest fear he had felt disappeared completely. He understood that she had truly prepared all of that for a mere human. The terrifying dragon he had imagined no longer existed before his eyes. In its place appeared an image so stunning that it left him completely speechless. Without wasting more time, Ruri continued with the ritual. She announced that now both would read the vows they had written for each other. Ferda lowered his gaze to the paper he held in his hands. For a brief moment he hesitated and thought that now that he had returned to the past, those words no longer held the same meaning. Still, he took a deep breath and began to read his vows. He expressed that she did not know him well, but that he did know her. He remembered that she had given him her heart and that thanks to that heart he had come to know everything about her. He had seen how she was betrayed and blamed over and over again. He had also seen how she carried out her duties with dignity. Despite everything, he remembered that she even embraced those who hated her without reason and admired her noble decision not to abandon what she wished to protect. For that reason he swore in that very place that just as she gave him her heart, this time he would offer her his. He promised to dedicate his heart to his sovereign and to the most important person to him. After a brief pause, he smiled softly before adding a few words that had never been written in the prepared vows. He confessed that that was not part of the original text, but that it was an absolute honor to be engaged to such a beautiful woman as her. Even after hearing those sincere words, Ruri's expression remained surprisingly calm. She simply nodded and announced that it was the future bride's turn to read her vows. However, before finishing the sentence, Archduchess Valdrova suddenly stood up, without saying a single word, and hurried back behind the door. The unexpected reaction left both Ruri and Ferda completely surprised. For a few seconds, silence filled the entire room. Then, to Ferda's surprise, Ruri smiled warmly and announced that the engagement ceremony had concluded. From behind the closed door, Valdrova's embarrassed voice was heard. She apologized and asked if it would be possible to remain isolated for about 3 days. Ruri entered the room with a smile that grew even wider after hearing those words. Looking at her mistress, she commented cheerfully that it was just like her to have landed such a devastating blow against that proud young man. She stated that she truly possessed the noble elegance of a dragon and that from the beginning everything had been part of a plan. She confessed that even she had been completely fooled by that unexpected retreat. She also commented that thanks to that, all the initiative now remained in her mistress's hands. While she kept joking, she couldn't hide the amusement in her voice. However, although Valdrova had looked forward to that engagement ceremony with excitement, the expression on her face showed something completely different. Instead of the serene and dignified Archduchess everyone knew, she was completely flushed and too embarrassed to look at anyone after hearing Ferda's sincere confession. Valdrova admitted in a low voice that she had also wanted to read her own vows, as well as the welcome message for her future partner. Hearing that, Ruri asked in confusion why she hadn't done so. Valdrova lowered her gaze and explained that she simply hadn't been able to look Ferda in the eyes while speaking those words. She felt that the young man's intense gaze pierced through her entire being, while his calm and gentle voice only made it harder to keep her composure. The very instant she looked at him, her mind went completely blank and she was unable to speak any of the words she had prepared. Ruri let out a long sigh before answering that even her own mind was starting to get confused. Then she apologized for saying something like that on such a happy day, but commented that in moments like that it was necessary to be prepared for possible disappointment. Valdrova looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant by preparing for disappointment. Ruri carefully explained that Ferda was now officially Valdrova's fiancée, which meant he would govern the East in place of the Grand Archduchess. She also warned that many humans changed once they obtained power, just as had happened in the past with the third imperial prince. Then she apologized for making her mistress remember those painful events from several decades ago, but insisted that that was the most sincere advice she could offer. Valdrova listened in silence before responding that she perfectly understood her concern. She explained that mortals were destined to disappear someday and that the best thing would be to bury that strange feeling. She calmly repeated those same words, although in her voice one could sense a deep sadness, as if she were trying to convince herself more than anyone else. After that, the engagement ceremony officially came to an end. Later, Ferda lay alone in his room, staring at the ceiling while reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought that he had truly managed to get engaged to the great Valdrova and that the feeling was very strange. In the past he had been consumed by hatred and rage, so he could never feel anything different, nor did he have the chance to. However, this time everything was different. From that moment on, he couldn't stop wanting to experience that feeling again. His red circle had completely gotten out of control. A circle that lost control always threatened to destroy its bearer. However, if controlled in the right way, that same impossible-to-control power could become an opportunity to grow incredibly. Ferda had already reached the peak of magic in his past life, so reaching that level again was no longer an impossible challenge. A circle needed two essential things to evolve: mental strength and mana. As a first circle mage, the amount of mana he could handle was still very low, but his mental strength, which had once reached the level of an archmage, was more than enough to compensate. With total confidence, he focused all his attention on the violent mana coursing through his body. He spun that uncontrolled mana without wasting a single part with a spell. Carefully guiding each thread of mana into its place, he joined them one on top of another and created his second circle. With that he could take another step closer to her. Shortly after, Ruri arrived and observed him with a clear expression of surprise. He had reached the second circle in just 3 days. That growth rate was truly surprising. She had noticed that the door was closed and felt curious. She wondered if red circle mages normally grew that fast. Ferda calmly denied it. He explained that it depended on each person. Although his answer seemed simple, he knew the truth was much deeper. Deep down, Ferda thought about the hidden price of red circle power. A red circle's growth had a side effect. Every time a new circle was formed, it was necessary to seek an even more intense emotion. In the end, the strongest emotion the circle remembered would end up becoming a permanent part of whoever possessed it. In the past, he had awakened his circle through hatred. Even after fulfilling his revenge, he couldn't stop. He kept looking for more things to hate. Remembering those painful days only made his decision not to repeat the same mistake in this life even firmer. Shortly after, Ruri guided him through the entire fortress until they stopped in front of a large hall. That was the ruler's office, where he would work from that moment on as the Archduchess's representative. When Ferda entered, he observed the place in silence. Although it was a dragon's fortress, in every corner one could feel the consideration toward her fiancé. It was surprising to think that all of that had been prepared for a man. Every detail made him understand how much effort had been put into welcoming him. Without wasting more time, Ferda straightened his back and decided to begin his first job as regent of the Archduchess. He immediately organized the entire situation in his mind. At that moment, Valdrova's territory was practically abandoned by the Archduchess. However, since he had shown Tesalos's head and revealed all his crimes, the lords acted very cautiously around him. Thanks to Ruby's help, everything had become much simpler. The first thing would be to send letters to the lords he had previously met with. While Ferda finished writing the letters, Ruri watched him curiously and wanted to know what he planned to write in his first official greeting since taking office. Ferda answered without hesitation. He would only inform them that from that moment on they would work together. Since he would handle internal affairs as regent, anyone who disagreed with that decision didn't need to respond because he respected all of Valdrova's lords. Shortly after, those letters were delivered to all the nobles of the territory. With that matter resolved, Ferda could focus on a much greater threat. The next problem was the monsters. Those creatures contaminated the fertile lands just by existing and were responsible for the death of countless innocent people. Grand Duchess Valdrova remained busy stopping disaster-level giant monsters. However, even someone as powerful as her had limits. It was impossible for her to eliminate all the minor monsters scattered across such a vast territory. Sitting silently in his office, Ferda analyzed the entire situation before deciding that first he would need to gather truly capable people. Ruri immediately asked if he already had someone in mind. In response, Ferda handed her a document filled with numerous names. After reviewing the list, both left the castle to begin the search for the first candidate. While traveling, Ruri looked at the document again and commented that they would have to personally seek out the first candidate, who was also a completely unknown scholar. Finally, their journey took them to the famous city of scholars, Eskla. While walking through its crowded streets, Ferda explained that it was normal for her not to know him. He was a talent that had not yet appeared before the world. Ruby remained unconvinced. She thought it would be a problem to bring just anyone to handle governance and wondered if that list had been written without thinking. Ferda calmly denied it. He explained that he would never do something like that. Although that list didn't seem important, it had taken him a very long time to gather all that information. As he spoke, memories from his past life appeared again in his mind from long ago. That list had actually been his list of targets. He had studied each of their achievements to hate them even more. He had also carefully observed all their weaknesses in order to take revenge someday. In those days he was completely consumed by hatred and desperately sought anything or anyone he could despise. Now, looking back, he understood that all of that had been nothing more than simple paranoia. Those dark memories reminded him of the person he had been and further strengthened his decision not to repeat the same mistakes. As they continued walking through the crowded streets of Eskla, a cheerful vendor called out to them from his stall and offered them some snacks. Ferda approached and asked if many graduates from the academy also visited that place. The vendor proudly replied yes. Although the business seemed simple, he had been selling there for many years. Hearing that, Ferda asked another question. He wanted to know if he knew the famous disheveled scholar. Ruri scolded him, asking if he was going to turn the castle into complete chaos, while for the vendor that nickname was quite well known. However, he explained that he was too busy attending to his business to remember all faces. He couldn't quite recall exactly who that was. Before leaving, Ferda asked how much the snacks cost. The vendor replied that 5 copper coins were enough for 3 skewers. Noticing that Ruri had been staring at the skewers the whole time, Ferda immediately bought them and handed them to her. Then he smiled slightly, surprised that she liked that kind of thing. Ruri quickly turned her face away. She implied that she had only paid attention to get the information. However, although she tried to appear serious, her reaction made it clear that she actually wanted to eat them. As they continued walking through the city, Ferda watched Ruri out of the corner of his eye and smiled to himself. He had always thought that she could be a person whose emotions had gone cold just like his own. However, she was also capable of showing such childlike expressions. Feeling that Ferda was staring at her, Ruri misunderstood his intentions and grew a bit nervous, taking a small step back. Almost instinctively, without saying another word, they both continued their search. At that moment, as they passed by a nearby building, a loud voice came from one of the rooms. Apparently they could miss the right moment. The desperate voice of another man was also heard.